Welcome back to part 2 of this fireside chat with Dr. Neil Bauman. And now we're going to be covering Meniere's disease, tinnitus, and ototoxic drugs. So let's start out with Meniere's disease. It's kind of near and dear to my heart. My mother was challenged with this for so long. She would just get so dizzy and just miserable with it. And for our guest, Dr. Neil, if you would care to talk a little bit about Meniere's disease and what it is, what are the symptoms, and what are the best treatments?
Meniere's disease is an interesting thing because it's not really a disease. What Meniere's is a collection of 4 symptoms. First one is tinnitus. The second one is hearing loss. The third one is vertigo. And the fourth one is a feeling of fullness in your ears. Now, what happens is you will get periodic attacks. And what will happen is you lose hearing. It's sort of like it goes down 2 steps, then it comes back 1 step. Next time you have an attack, another 2 steps down, 1 step back. So your hearing slowly goes down. Doctors don't really know what it is. And so they don't really have any true plan of attack or treatment for it. But serendipitously, a few years ago, I ran across just a 1-sentence little report, and it said that a certain doctor by the name of Michael Burkan, who is a chiropractor, had found a treatment for it. And I said, wow, because I had written my book on Meniere's disease. You can see this is the 4th edition. The first 3 editions knew nothing about this, and so I was sort of peddling the typical line of what Meniere's was. And what doctors think it is in your inner ear, you have 2 different fluids. One is called endolymph, the other one's called perilymph. Think of them as 2 balloons. The big balloon is the perilymph balloon, and inside it is the endolymph balloon. And if you got too much pressure in the endolymph, in other words, if your body creates too much endolymph and doesn't absorb it fast enough, it puts pressure in your inner ear and causes damage and destroys it. And so doctors, even today, they're worried about what is it? And they're trying to figure out how can we make the body produce the right amount of endolymph or absorb it faster. But the truth of the matter is that's not the thing. When you go down to the root of it, you find that the problem is right in your top 2 vertebrae in your neck. Your C1 and C2, sometimes called the atlas, and the axis. And if they get out of proper alignment, even by a little bit, can be just a very, very little, a 1.5 millimeters, that's all it takes. And if you're out by that little bit, it can pinch the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is the one that controls your balance and your hearing. And that's why you get these various symptoms. And when it gets pinched, it can't send messages up and down. So what happens? Things don't work properly, and you get an imbalance of fluid pressure in your inner ear, and you end up with Meniere's. And so what Dr. Burkan found was that if he adjusted the atlas and the axis, and he takes precision x-rays so he could see that little amount that's off that doctors don't see in x-rays they take, radiologists don't see them in the MRIs they take. But it's very obvious when you look at these precision x-rays that you're off. And all these chiropractors do is they just nudge those bones back to where they should be, and right away, your Meniere's is under control. Dr. Burkan was telling me he had people that would crawl on their hands and knees in the aisle up to the treatment room, barfing into a garbage can. The vertigo is giving them, nausea, and they're throwing up all the time. He goes along and takes his x-rays, figures out which way they're out, pushes them back in, and they can go skipping out the door, and they never have vertigo again.
Oh, how I wish I would have had this information to help my mom. She
Wouldn't it be
was
something?
so miserable. One time they were here visiting, and she was fine. We were celebrating Dad's birthday, and she went into the bathroom, and she had an episode. and she could not get out of the bathroom by herself. Her whole world was upside down. I mean, and my husband ended up, we got her calmed down, and he had to kind of carry her to the car. We got her home and got her comfortable, and she had some medication at home that would help her. But oh gosh, if she could have had a tweak. I'm a firm believer in chiropractic. So that is so good to know. That's why we're doing this, to get this information out there to help more people. And thank you for all you're doing with that. So,
Now, what I've got to mention, and these are not conventional chiropractors.
okay.
Yes, they are conventional in the sense that they have their DC,
Okay.
but then they've taken extra training in upper cervical. And so they're called upper cervical or spine or upper cervical chiropractors.
Okay.
And if you go to them, they practice different, they all learn in different chiropractic schools, so they have different specialties. And Dr. Bacon is a Blair chiropractor. And all he does is he puts he put his hand by your neck there, and he just goes bam on like that, and that's it. None of this
It
business
almost
grabbing
seems
your
like you
head.
could do it yourself,
Well, if you knew where to do it, but
There you go.
I don't. You've got to know that it's right.
You should go to a professional.
There's many others. There's the NUCA, there's Spinology, there's Grostic, there's knee chest, so they have all these different names, but they all do basically the same thing, one way or another. So if you have Menieres, I recommend go to one of these guys. Some of them are not easy to find. They're few and far between. But I started, after writing about Menieres and telling people about it and teaching about it, I started having little minor episodes of vertigo. I'd look up at the light, and here the light was moving in a circle around the ceiling, or the ceiling was spinning itself. And I started realizing, why am I so stupid? I'm writing about this. I must have the beginnings of Menieres. So I found the closest upper cervical guy, who happened to be a NUCA guy, and he was about an hour and a half away. I went out to see him, and after 2 treatments, it didn't seem that he'd done anything. Nothing seemed any different. But I've noticed now in the last 3 years, I've never had an episode of even beginning to have that vertigo. So he just put my neck right back in place.
That is fascinating. But my first inclination when you were explaining about that is, could it have been psychosomatic, because you were thinking about it and learning about it, that maybe, but probably not.
Not in that sense, because
right.
I wasn't thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
It was the last thing I was thinking about. I mean, I'm trying to walk down the hall to the bathroom, and I'm pushing myself off the wall because I kept falling over.
It's such a terrible feeling I've had with that from electromagnetic radiation, actually. So,
but the same idea, you lose your balance, and of course I didn't. It was just the incipient part. Now, one of the interesting things about Menieres, Dr. Bacon found that almost exclusively people have had whiplash or some head trauma or neck trauma, like when they were in college, guys playing football ran into the goalpost and knocked himself out or something. That knocks your vertebrae, those top 2 vertebrae, just off enough that maybe 15 or 20 or 25 years later, you start to experience this. It doesn't happen right away. So there's that long delay, and
latency. Yes,
you've totally forgotten that you had that episode of a car accident or something. You've got to think back. But when he puts them back in, as long as your bones hold, that's one thing you also need to realize. One treatment, he can put you back in where you should be, but because your ligaments and your tendons have been out for, say, 20 years, they easily slip back out. And so you may have to go back again the next day and the next day. And maybe next week you got to go back a couple of times, and each time they stay in a little longer. Right. And then once he's got you in and you hold, you don't have Menieres anymore.
What a blessing. That is so good to know. And again, I'm sure so many don't realize that. And like you say, there's probably a strong connection between sports like football, where it's such a violent, you get hit so much. Concussions too. But Wow, that's amazing.
any concussion.
Yeah, yes.
But it could be just whiplash. And
Hmm.
your neck goes off. And it's interesting because Menieres, you normally get it on one side at a time. About 15% of people will end up with Menieres on both ears, but most only ever have it in one. And that's because when the vertebrae go out and pinch the nerve in a certain way, it's for the side for one ear. You've got to have a really interesting way of having them out in order to pinch the nerve to damage both ears at once.
So would it be important, I mean, when you say one ear, do you have that dizziness on like the one side of your peripheral or your vision or?
Well, the dizziness is everywhere,
Yeah,
but what you hear is you have the hearing loss in that ear,
okay,
and you have the feeling of fullness in that ear,
I see.
and you get the tinnitus typically in that ear, but sometimes tinnitus is hard to tell. It could just be in your head.
Okay. Well, I mean, and that's an excellent lead in. I was wanting to ask you about tinnitus. It seems as though tinnitus is kind of an equal opportunity influencer on several different conditions and can come about by different things because I'm so focused on the health impacts from wireless technology, where tinnitus is one of the many symptoms, as I'm sure you know. But then you said it enters the picture with Menieres, and I'm just wondering if you'd like to talk about that and what steps can be taken to reduce your risk of getting tinnitus on that.
Tinnitus is very common, and the most common cause of tinnitus would be hearing loss. Because when your brain doesn't get proper stimulation, you can end up with tinnitus. I'm not going to go into all the details of what goes on in your brain,
Right.
but you hear ringing, roaring, hissing, humming, beating, banging, clacking. You know, there's a whole pile of different tinnitus sounds. Like, for example, mine is a very high-pitched, hissy whine. And I've had this all my life. But then I was born with severe hearing loss, and so that's why I have tinnitus. Now,
Mm.
I have other kinds of things. I have one rather interesting one in this ear. It comes and goes. It sounds like a flock of birds twittering in the trees. And
Really?
so I don't let it bother me. I say, oh, isn't that cool? Especially if I'm out walking and on the street and there's the trees and I hear the birds twittering, but it's only ever in this ear. Never goes to this one. Tinnitus, sometimes you can hear it in one ear, sometimes the other, sometimes in both ears, and other times you just hear it in your head and it's not associated with either ear. So tinnitus changes that way. And some people get worried, they hear it in this ear, now they're hearing in this one. No big deal. It's just the way it works.
Different ways of coping. And I heard a term probably from your book about reactive tinnitus. Would you want to speak to what is reactive tinnitus?
Reactive tinnitus is tinnitus that gets louder as the background or the sounds around you get louder. And so if you go outside and maybe you're walking down the street and there's a lot of traffic noise, and the louder the traffic, the louder your tinnitus. Now, some doctors and audiologists, they say there's no such thing as reactive tinnitus, but the people that have it, yes, they get it.
Interesting.
Now, what reactive tinnitus is really two pieces. You've got tinnitus and you've got hyperacusis. And hyperacusis is where you hear normal sounds abnormally loud. Typically, they're higher frequency sounds. And so you put the two together and you've got reactive tinnitus. If you don't want to put them together, don't call it reactive tinnitus. Say I've got tinnitus and hyperacusis. And it's the same
That's
thing.
amazing. It's kind of like the noises that you hear are competing with background noises. Like, you can't drown me out. I want you to hear bells and whistling and high pitched
Very,
sounds.
very much. And there's so much hyperacusis around. Now, I've just mentioned the most common cause of tinnitus would be hearing loss. Most people, like 80%, 90%, 95%, depending on whose figures you look at, say tinnitus accompanies hearing loss, especially if you have quite a severe hearing loss and quite fast. You notice right away you've got tinnitus. Second most important cause of tinnitus is exposing your ears to loud noise. Now, there's No reason for that. You can put earplugs in your ears if you're going to a loud concert, if you're going to a loud football game, if you're going to a NASCAR race, if you're out shooting, whatever it is. If it's noisy, wear earplugs, and then you won't get tinnitus. And the
Excellent
third, I
advice.
got one more. Third most common cause of tinnitus is drugs. And we're not talking about recreational drugs, we're talking about medical drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know of probably at least 600 different generic drugs that can give you tinnitus. So it's very, very common. And a lot of times it's the first thing you notice. And if you start getting tinnitus from a drug, you might want to get off it right away and tell your doctor you want a different drug, because it could also give you hearing loss. It could also give you all kinds of balance problems.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, and we're going to be covering a little bit more about that. I know you've done a lot of work in this area, but before we move into that, I wanted to, because I'm familiar with tinnitus as being a symptom of extreme hyper electrosensitivity, or EHS, from wireless technology, from electromagnetic radiation coming from wireless devices, for example, that's all around us. And it's so prolific now in our world that they call it electrosmog, as you probably know. So when you're working with your clients, or do you cover this in your books about the connection between tinnitus and this exposure, would that be a good place to start, to ask them about their habits? Like, do they use cell phones? Do they have, do they wire their wireless devices and turn off their Wi-Fi router, whatever?
But it would be good to do that. I deal so much with people that have hearing loss, so that's my first one. And a lot of people, I'm just answering emails this morning about people that wreck their ears with too much noise. Now they got tinnitus. Well, that's where you got it from. And drugs, so many. So I haven't come across people that I could identify and say, yes, you've got it from electrosmog.
It's hard to track the cause, because there's
well,
so many
especially
symptoms.
if you've got a special one. Like a person starts taking a drug, like the person this morning, they took ibuprofen. They get tinnitus, they get hearing loss, and they quit taking it, and it went away. Well, it was good, because most people don't get it, it doesn't go away for them. So right away, I didn't have to go for the electrosmog. But if I can't find any other cause, then it's time to go further afield and see. But if a person told me that they are sensitive to electromagnetic radiation, then a lot of their tinnitus could be. I was just reading some figures that roughly about half of the people that have this have tinnitus, compared to about 17% of the people that are not exposed to the electrosmog. So it's important. I mean, it is there. And I don't have anything in my current book on tinnitus on that, but it's already written for the next edition whenever it comes out. And there will be a section on tinnitus and electrosmog and what you can do about it.